before welcoming Sandy, and I have the very special privilege of being able to host this seminar today. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Mike Wingfield. I'm sitting here in FABI, beautiful FABI, on a wonderful early autumn afternoon. Sun is starting to go down, getting a little bit chillier for us here, and I'm going to hand over to Dr. Neriman Yilmaz, who will say a few words and then come back to me.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Neriman Yilmaz, and I would like to welcome all of you to the FABI International Seminar for ETHO. First of all, I would like to thank Mike and Brett for inviting our speaker. Today, we would like to continue. We will be continuing our series with a very exciting seminar. And initially, we would like to host this with Center for Innovation Biology with Prof. David Richardson. But unfortunately, he's having some technical issues. Therefore, we cannot really make the connection for time. But let's see, maybe at the end of the meeting, he can join us. So thanks again, Mike and Brett, for inviting our speaker. And I am handing it over to Mike to introduce our speaker, which we are very excited about. Thank you.
Neriman, thank you very much. And if David Richardson has connected, we will, if we hear from him, we'll allow David a few minutes to say hello from the CIB. Otherwise, we'll try to connect with him a little bit later and give him the opportunity to say a few words about the CIB and what they're doing. Some wonderful work there. And Sandy has had a long and fruitful connection with the CIB, also attending some of their seminars over the years. So I hope that does happen. But again, to everyone and those who have just joined, we have a wonderful audience for the seminar today. And Sandy, that will tell you a little bit, it should warm your heart and tell you a little bit about how popular you are and how much people enjoy listening to you, or will enjoy, if they haven't in the past, enjoy the seminar today. Sandy is a very special friend of many of us, those in the audience today, and of numerous people in FABI. Neriman has mentioned Brett. And Sandy, I'll tell you that we had a bit of a competition who would have the honor of sitting here. I won the competition, as is perhaps obvious. But numerous emails went back and forth, Brett and Bernard saying, well, you know, you can, I will, we would like to, you know, all of that stuff. But it is a very special privilege for us as a team in FABI, but also for me to be able to welcome you. We want a lot of time for this seminar, and I'm certainly not going to go through FABI's very extensive CV and to go through his many, many accomplishments. All of you have access to that information, and you know why you're here. You're here to enjoy a seminar from one of the, if not the best known and most accomplished forest entomologists in the world. And that I think says almost enough. I could say many things about Sandy's special contributions. Different people interpret impact and contributions from academic scientists in different ways. Different aspects of people's accomplishments appeal to different people. I could just touch on one or two or three things. As I've already said, one of the best known, most accomplished forest entomologists in the world. Sandy has made a very, very special contribution towards understanding the global movement of forest pests, and specifically to help us to understand economic aspects. That, perhaps, Sandy, is a space that many others have not been in, and you have really made a huge contribution to. I remember sharing the stage with you in New Zealand. I don't know if you were in New Zealand at that time, in a seminar series, where you introduced the importance of alley effects, and it's something that I had not thought about at that time, started to think about those effects also in the pathogen space, and you've really driven people's, our understanding of how important they are in the success of biological invasions. And in more recent years, Sandy has done some really remarkable work with colleagues, of course, and I'm sure he'll touch on some of this to do with the importance of the analysis of spatial dynamics in terms of invasion biology. And I could go on and on. Sandy, I thought I would say a little bit about UFRO, because you have many UFRO friends here. But if I start that, I might touch on it maybe in the question time later. But Sandy has made huge contributions to this amazing organization globally, for which many of us, myself as past president, feel very, very grateful. But I'm going to stop there, Sandy, and hand over to you, ask you to share your screen. I'm trying not to look at this screen here, so I look at a camera that's in front of me, and ask you to share your screen and then start to speak with us. So welcome again to all. Welcome again to Sandy. Thank you for being with us.
Well, gosh, thanks, Mike. That's really a very nice introduction. And I'm actually really excited to be here, of course. And, you know, in many ways, I wish that I was there in Pretoria, because for me, visiting every time, you know, I've visited several times to FABI, and every time I go to FABI, I always feel it's like visiting Mecca, you know, that it's sort of like such an incredible center for tree health research. And so every time I visit, I come back just kind of really filled with all kinds of new ideas and really learn a lot. But on the other hand, I suppose, you know, with this whole pandemic situation, there's also sort of a silver lining that, I mean, gosh, this is so cool to be able to connect to so many of our colleagues all over the world. And you know, let's see, I don't even have any shoes on. So that's actually, I don't really like wearing shoes. So this is very nice to be able to give my talk without wearing shoes. So anyway, yeah, so I'm going to be talking today about, you know, basically sort of the big picture of insect invasions. And, you know, when the whole subject of biological invasions, as probably most of you know, it's really, the whole problem of biological invasions is really primarily driven by one thing, and that's increased human mobility, that the world's biota, it evolved sort of compartmentalized into continents and other barriers. And then over the last 2 centuries, the increasing human mobility, both travel and trade, has reconnected these continents, and we're seeing species moved around the world, and sometimes with not such great consequences. And of course, I'm going to be focusing on insect invasions, and all these, I have a few graphs here, which I think are actually quite interesting, and they all basically show the same thing. If you look over on the left, this is some data from Japan, basically showing numbers of insect invasions by decade, and you can see there's been a roughly constant rate of invasions of these species. Similar up on the upper right, we have this graph that Eki and I put together from several sources comparing cumulative numbers of forest insect invasions. And you see a very similar pattern in all these data. The bottom right is from one of Hanno Sieben's papers showing all insect first records. And you basically, they all sort of point to the same thing, that somewhere around 1850, all of a sudden the switch went on and we started accumulating new insect invasions. And that point in time roughly coincides with the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So I think to a certain extent, you can say that insect invasions are basically a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution and increased human mobility. I always feel like with insect invasions, we always sort of, you know, those who are study insect invasions, we sort of live in the shadow of people that study plant invasions, because plant invasions have been studied for a much longer time. And so there's really more known about plant invasions than there are insect invasions. And I think it's really kind of interesting when you think, of course, there are more insect species than all other animal species. And it's probably no surprise that because of that, there are more insect invasions than all other animal species, just because in the world's biota, we have insects are just such a species-rich group of organisms. Of course, it's interesting if you look into comparing the sort of proportional representation of plants to other organisms. It is kind of amazing how many plant invasions there are. And I suppose part of that is because it's sort of one of these things that humans have this interesting tendency that they really like to move plants around the world. But there are basically a lot of insect invasions as well. One of the things that was pointed out several years ago by a paper by Petr Píšek and others that there is a sort of taxonomic bias in the literature on invasions, that plant invasions really are much more better represented in the literature, and that, you know, in their study that the number of papers that focused on insect invasions is really quite small. It's only around 18%, even though there are so many insect species and so many of them have invaded new parts of the world. So this gets back to this fact that we're sort of always catching up with the plant invasion, people studying plant invasions. I think they've sort of set the course for invasion biology, and we're just sort of rediscovering many of the things that they've already figured out. And it is kind of ironic that insect invasions are so poorly studied, because the impacts of insect invasions are kind of, you know, I don't think I have to explain that. They're just massive in terms of their impacts in agriculture and forestry, human health, and impacts on ecosystem processes and properties that affect humans. And so I think one of the things that's, for me, it's kind of an interesting sort of story of how I know personally I became sort of interested in this big picture of insect invasions. And it goes back to a workshop actually that was organized at the Center for Invasion Biology at University of Stellenbosch University. And back in 2014, at that time, Matt Hill was a postdoc at the university, at the CIB, and he had the idea to organize this workshop on insect invasions. And it's like, wow, I don't think I'd certainly never been to a workshop on insect invasions, because like I said, that none of us had really, even though I, like many others, have been doing entomology research for a long time, this whole sort of subject of insect invasions is a subject that we should study. It's not something that kind of received this kind of comprehensive attention. And Matt asked me to give a keynote presentation at the workshop, and this really kind of got my mind thinking, because to be honest, again, there really at that time hadn't been sort of a big picture analysis of what's the sort of big picture of insect invasions. And I had to sort of scramble to put together material for my presentation at that workshop. But that workshop was really kind of a game changer for me. And I think it got me thinking, and probably other people at the workshop thinking about this question. And so following that workshop, actually there was a special issue of Biological Invasions that was published for that. And so several of us at the conference, we decided to write a few papers looking at some of these big picture analyses of insect invasions. And one of the things that we decided to look at was just comparing the numbers of insect invasions in different parts of the world and trying to better understand that. And so what we did is we took data like species inventories that we found basically like 45 different world regions where we could find data on numbers of non-native insects, and as well as numbers of native insects in these different world regions. And we basically took those data, and one of the things you can see, this is basically a frequency distribution of the numbers of species that we found at this. Of course, these numbers are constantly changing because we find that there are more species we didn't know about. And but this is one of these things I'm not sure I'm really that proud of it, but North America, we do seem to be the region with the largest number of insect invasions, followed closely by the Hawaiian Islands, which is kind of remarkable. And then New Zealand and Europe also have quite large numbers as well. And so of course, one of the immediate questions is, well, why do some areas have more species than others? And this is a question that biogeographers have considered for many years, not necessarily with non-native organisms, but with all different taxa of organisms. And there's this very ubiquitous, what we call species area relationships, where the numbers of species in the region, there's this log-log relationship, log-log linear relationship between numbers of species and land area. And so we thought, well, it turns out that indeed for non-native, for both native insect species as well as non-native species, we do see these nice log linear relationships, and that explains a lot of the variation. But you can see that there's still a lot of variation around these relationships. And so we were wondering, well, are there other factors that explain this variation? And so we decided, well, when you're looking at numbers of invasive species in different regions, really kind of boils down to two things. One is variation in propagule pressure, and the other is a variation in habitat invasibility of the region. And so for propagule pressure, we thought, well, we could look at the distance to the mainland areas, as well as the number of people would be another proxy for propagule pressure, because we know that historically it's people in one way or another that bring non-native organisms to new areas. And the other, then we also, for invasibility, we considered latitude, land area, of course, as I mentioned, the species area relationship, as well as numbers of plant species that probably for herbivorous insects would be important. And so we basically were interested in how all of these factors affected both numbers of native insect species and numbers of non-native species. And so the trouble with these kind of analyses is that a lot of times these variables are all correlated with each other. So statistically, it's very difficult to kind of tease apart these relationships. And so we applied a structural equation model, which I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with, but it's a really powerful method for teasing apart causal interactions when you have a lot of co-varying variables. And so with these kind of analyses, you end up with these sort of flowchart type relationships, and the strengths of these arrows reflect the strength of the relationship in the structural equation model. And so what you might want to focus on here is, well, first we looked at numbers of both native and non-native insect species. And it turns out for native insect species, by far, the thing that has the biggest impact on species richness is numbers of native plants. And for non-native insects, the things that had the strongest impact was numbers not only of native plants, but also numbers of non-native plants in that region. And it turned out that things like in fact, kind of wild was that it turns out that land area, which we know is at least correlated, as the structural equation model didn't really identify a significant causal interaction between land area and numbers of non-native insects. Instead, it indicated that land area affects the species richness of native plants, and that has a big impact on numbers of non-native insects. So in other words, and so the fascinating thing there was that this idea that diversity or species richness of both native and non-native insects is driven by plant diversity. And I was going to mention a similar analysis we did with another group did a few years later using these data that it's a data set that it's a fascinating data set that we compiled a few years ago on numbers of non-native forest non-native forest insects and diseases that have impacts on forests. And as you can see, it has this very strong pattern that we have more of this species in the northeastern United States. And the question, of course, is always why. And again, we turn to say variation propagule pressure. We know historically people have lived in the northeastern United States for longer than other parts of the country. But also there's a question of invasibility that we know tree diversity is much higher in the eastern US than it generally is in the West. And so we applied this structural equation modeling approach, though, to look at a whole bunch of other possible factors. And again, we found this relationship where host tree richness had this really positive, the strongest impact on numbers of insect and disease species. Again, indicating that the geographical variation in species richness is numbers of invading species is driven by plant diversity. And so the question is, well, why is that? And I think to sort of understand why that is, you really have to understand the way food webs are organized. That of course, at the bottom of all food webs are the producers, are the plants. And so for insects, we have herbivores, and then we have higher trophic levels, the things that eat the herbivores, and insects, occupy ecological niches in both these trophic levels. But from these kind of things, you can see that the diversity of both herbivores and the things that eat herbivores is really driven by the diversity of the producers. So the more plant species you have, the more opportunities you have for insect diversity and really at all trophic levels. And this probably explains these relationships, I think. And the story is actually a little bit more complicated because this is something, again, in this paper from a couple of years ago, we were looking at variation in the United States. We recognize there are really two things going on that affect these. One is what's called the dilution effect. And this is something that Evie Jactel, who's on this call, and Eki have identified as also, especially at smaller scales, is quite important in affecting numbers and diversity of insects. That is that the more plant species you have, it actually can be more difficult for insects to find their hosts, and you may have lower numbers. But then at the same time, you have this facilitation effect, which is what I was referring to in these food webs. The more plant species you have, the more that creates basically more ecological niches for herbivores and for the things that eat herbivores. And so I think both of these are operating simultaneously and are responsible for the diversity of both native and non-native plant insect species that we see around the world. Kind of a related thing on this, which I think is quite interesting, is the relationship between plant invasions and insect invasions. As I was showing before, we saw that when we look at these large-scale patterns, that numbers of non-native plants actually have a huge influence on the diversity of insect assemblages. And this is one of the things, of course, there are plant invasions all around the world that, as I mentioned before, people love to move plants around the world, and many of these plants end up becoming invasive. And one of the things I think we're really learning is that these invasive plants, they basically create ecological niches for insects and actually facilitate insect invasions. And this is something, it's not only for accidentally introduced plants, but I think for also intentionally plants that are moved around. This is data from one of your great paper in Science from several years ago, showing the distribution of eucalyptus, I think, which is a good example of a plant that's planted around the world and has become quite dominant in many parts of the world, even though it's native only to Australia. And from Brett's great paper from several years ago showed very nicely that as eucalyptus has been moved around the world, there's been this sort of steady trickle of herbivores that specialize on eucalyptus that have invaded various world regions. So I think this really provides a very nice example of how plant invasions really facilitate insect invasions, and really it's explained a large amount of the variation we see in numbers of insect invasions around the world. So another thing that we were interested in looking at was, are there some insect groups, insects are a very diverse group of organisms, and are there some groups of insects that are more prone to invasions than others? And so again, we turn to the same database on numbers of non-native insects in different world regions, and we analyze the data with regard to at the order level, the insect order level. And say we ended up, this is a technique that we ended up applying to many different world regions. And we basically simply plot the numbers of non-native species versus the numbers of native species, and do this for various orders. And one of the things that you see in these kind of plots is that certain insect taxa are overrepresented among non-native species. So, for example, one of the things we see are sap-feeding insects like the Hemiptera and the Thysanoptera tend to be overrepresented. And I'll probably talk more about this, but I think part of this is maybe explained by pathways that we know that these sap-feeding insects, they tend to become associated with plants that are moved around the world. And so this may have facilitated their invasions. Also, we know Hemiptera, many of the Hemiptera can reproduce asexually, and this may have facilitated their invasions because they can overcome allele effects and establish very low founder populations. And then we also have, for example, the Blattioidea, the cockroaches. We know that cockroaches very often have this intimate association with humans and do very well in human civilizations. And maybe this we've created nice habitats for cockroaches, and this explains why they've been very successful invaders. On the other hand, you have some other groups like the aquatic groups like the Ephemeroptera and Odonata, which are underrepresented. And that probably reflects, again, a pathway relationship that these species are associated with water, and we probably tend to move water around less than we move things like plants and cargo and this sort of thing. So, and the interesting thing is these kind of same patterns are very similar in different regions. These scatter plots here are for North America. This is the same data using data from Japan, and again you see the Hemiptera and the Thysanoptera as being overrepresented, the Neuroptera and aquatic group being underrepresented. And so it's amazing how these patterns are very consistent. And in fact, we applied an ordination method, non-metric multidimensional scaling, and this plot is a little bit complicated, but this is the Japan, the assemblages with the A after them are the alien assemblages, and the ones with the N's after them are the native assemblages. And then, so this is Galapagos, this is Japan, Sardinia, Corsica, Madeira, Spain. So the interesting thing on this, though, is you can see the alien assemblages, the first axis on this ordination, or I should say the ordination was based on the numbers of species within each order. You can see the alien assemblages are all over on the left-hand side of the ordination plot. In other words, that first axis, which explained most of the variation, that completely separated the composition of the native and the non-natives. So in other words, the mix of species among orders is completely different for native and non-native assemblages. And this sort of, I think, emphasizes that actually the types of species that invade, there is a very different tendency of some groups of organisms to invade versus other. And if you look at these are the loadings for the ordination. And again, you can see over on the left-hand side of these plots, which correspond with the non-native assemblages. This is where we see high numbers of Hemiptera, Thysanoptera, and then again, the aquatic orders are more over, like the Ephemeroptera, Plecoptera, they're associated with they're more dominant in the native assemblages. Again, reflecting difference in pathways. And of course, insects, they're it's one of the things with insects, there's so many, we tend to lump insects together, but really because of the incredible diversity within the insects, I think there are lots of other interesting stories even within individual orders. And so we've been taking we have some ongoing analyses where we're doing similar kind of analyses, but digging deeper into some of these individual insect orders. And I should mention that this is a collaboration, an ongoing collaboration. And I have to acknowledge this massive group that we have amassed. And it really is sort of centrally organized in a working group that's called the Global Socioeconomic Drivers of Insect Invasions, which is facilitated by the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center. This is actually a working group that Mike Springborn, who's at UC Davis, and I organized to focus on better understanding the socioeconomic drivers of insect establishments, invasions worldwide. And I just running through some of the collaborators, Adiba Puriswan in Canada, Derek Kellenberg in Montana State, Hanno Stevens in Germany, Alain Roque, who's in France. I have a group of postdocs at the Czech University of Life Sciences, Jirka Trumbeek, Richard Mali, Misha Sronova, and then my colleague Rachel Blake, who's a data scientist at Succinct, Cleo Bertelsmeyer and her PhD student Gita Fenimol-Too in University of Lausanne in Switzerland, a good friend, long collaborator Eki Brockerhoff with WSL in Switzerland, Matt McLaughlin, who's with USDA, Alan Nornberg, also with USDA, Barney Katon, who's with USDA APHIS, Takiko Yamanaka in Japan, Helen Narong in Australia, my good colleague Rebecca Turner, who's with Scion in New Zealand, Mike Springborn and Paul Mimbaze or UC Davis, my longtime technician, Gino Luzader, and Becky Panchinil, who's with Resources for the Future. And we have gotten support on this from the USDA Forest Service international programs. Anyway, with this massive effort, we've assembled data from around the world on numbers, basically lists of non-native species, non-native insect species from 10 world regions. And we've put together this database it's a relational database where we have data on where in the world those species are established, their taxonomy, listing what we know about their families, tribes, et cetera. And then the attributes about whether it was intentional release or where they're native, et cetera. And so we have around a little over 8,000 species, and they're essentially over 12,000 country occurrence records. And we've, to do these things, it's a massive data problem because you have to deal with synonymies and misspellings of species. And we've relied on the GBIF backbone for basically cleaning up these data and managing it. And so the first group we focused on are the beetles, because of course the beetles are this massively diverse insect order. So if you look at numbers of non-native beetles, again, it's not surprising. As I've seen before, the number of non-native insects are most diverse in North America. The same thing is true for beetles. We have the most species in North America, but of course not far behind are the Hawaiian Islands, Europe, Australia, and New Zealand. And we've done similar analyses, and again, the species area relationships explain a lot of the variation in numbers of beetle species, non-native beetles, both native and non-native beetle species. And the thing that's kind of interesting on all these is that the species area relationships tend to be more tightly associated for native species than they tend to be for non-native species. And this is something that people working with plants have seen before too. And I think what it really is because with native species, the species area relationships, they reflect the propensity for radiation diversification that's really strongly related to land area, where non-native species are affected by land area, but also, as I was mentioning before, a lot of other things that affect both invasibility and propagule pressure. With the beetle species, again, the numbers of species in different families, the Staphylinidae and the Curculionidae are the most species-rich families within the Coleoptera, and the same is true for the non-natives. They represent the bulk of non-native species around the world. The interesting thing is that the Curculionidae are primarily herbivorous. The Staphylinidae are primarily predators. But we do see some variation that some families are over or underrepresented. And when we do these similar plots of plotting numbers of non-native species among these 10 regions versus their number of species represented in the world, we do have some families that are overrepresented. And some of these, I think at least some of this can be explained probably by propagule pressure, which is related to their propensity for these organisms to get associated with pathways. So for example, the Dermestidae and the Bostrichidae, a lot of these the beetles in these families are associated with seeds and grain, and there's a long history of humans moving seed and grain around the world. And I think that explains why these species are probably overrepresented among in invasions. And with these data, we've done very similar analyses, as I'm showing before, at the order level, looking at, and again, it's kind of remarkable how, in this case, the non-native species are red, the native assemblages are blue. You have this complete separation, again, reflecting the fact that there's this very different mix of species among families, in this case for beetles. And one of the things that's interesting is you can see for the native species, you see certain regions, this case, East Asia, the assemblages are very similar for native species. But when you look at non-native species, you don't see these regional similarities. And again, I think it's because the native species, you have this natural radiation through evolution, whereas for the non-native species, it's driven mostly by variation in propagule pressure and invasiveness or invasibility. We've done, I'm just going to briefly mention some other work we've done with Lepidoptera. This is work my postdoc, Richard Mali at the Czech University of Life Sciences is leading. And in this group, we actually have a bigger switch that whereas the Erebidae and the Geometridae are the largest families in the world, it's for the non-native species, we have higher number of species in the Noctuidae and the Crambidae. And you see these in these plots, again, you have, this is numbers, again, of non-native species versus numbers of world species. And again, as I mentioned before, certain species in the Noctuidae and are overrepresented, the Geometridae are underrepresented. And the interesting things, we've done this, and this is where Rebecca Turner with Scion has helped out a lot with this. We've amassed this large data set on species interceptions from these same 10 world regions of interceptions at ports from port inspections. And we find in many cases, the species that are overrepresented among establishments, in this case, Noctuidae and Geometridae, you see these very similar patterns with over and underrepresentation among species that are intercepted. And because in a sense, these interceptions represent sort of a little window into the invasion pathways, I think what this is telling us is that these patterns of over and underrepresentation among establishments really are driven by over and underrepresentation in invasion pathways. That is that because of life, the biologies and life history traits, some species are more likely to get associated with invasion pathways than others. And we've also been looking at the actual commodities. This is something that Gita Fenta, who's at Lausanne University, has been focusing on of the commodities that these species are associated with during inspections. And the vast majority of Lepidoptera species are intercepted on plant imports, that plants that are intercepted at borders. And in fact, you see this is not just for Lepidoptera, but for all insects in general. This is showing numbers of species that are associated with, this is with plant products, and then zooming in within that plant product commodities. The live plant imports, this is something that we've been looking at for many years, and this just sort of drives home this message that plants provide this incredible, not only in terms of just numbers of insects on plants that are imported, but also the diversity of plants, of insects that are on imported plants is phenomenal. And again, ties together this amazing relationship between plant movement and insect movement. This is another interesting relationship with it, which again, ties home this relationship. This is looking again, this is work that Rebecca Turner has led on analyzing numbers of insect species in inspections among insects that are intercepted at borders, both in terms of numbers of intercepted species and total numbers of interceptions. We have the same pattern of the Hemiptera being certain orders, the Hemiptera and the Homoptera, the Hemiptera and the Thysanoptera being overrepresented among intercepted insects. which is, again, something we've recognized before, that sap-feeding insects tend to be very commonly associated with plants that are imported. And it kind of drives home, and I think contributes to explaining why the Hemiptera and the Thysanoptera are overrepresented among non-native insects, because they have this amazing propensity to become associated with, and actually, to be honest, they're very difficult to find on imported plants, and because they're somewhat cryptic, and this explains why these species in these orders have been such successful orders. The last thing I want to touch on is basically some temporal patterns we see in numbers of invading species over time. And so this is just a graph showing discoveries of non-native species among insects established in North America. And almost all these time series, we see these same kind of patterns where we had large number of establishments early on in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and then it fell off. And then more recently, it's increased again. And we see this is for total insects established in North America. This is from a paper that Cleo Bertelsmeyer published. We together with, I think Eki was on that as well, that we published on numbers of ant species established around the world. And these same kind of patterns, and Cleo saw among economists, they recognize what are called waves of globalization. That there was this first wave of globalization before World War II, and that's associated with lots of invasions. And then following World War II, there was a second wave of globalization, and also associated with many of these invasions since more recently. But the trouble is that with all these things, there are a lot of things. The trouble is there are a lot of moving parts that we know. There was World War II during this period. There was also the global economic crash. And so it's all very often difficult to sort out these drivers of what are the temporal drivers of insect invasions. And this is some work that collaboration with Matt McLaughlin and Mike Springborn, we've been working on for several years, focusing on Hemiptera, plant-feeding Hemiptera invasions. I was mentioning before, Hemiptera are a very successful group of invaders. And we know that they're largely, the pathway for movement of Hemiptera is largely with imported plants. And so the time series on the top shows imports of imported plants to the United States. And the time series on the bottom shows numbers of non-native Hemiptera establishing over the last 200 years. And again, you see this with both these time series, you do see this two waves of globalization, this big boom in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and then a second with the more modern period of globalization, another wave of imports. And you see similar patterns with establishments. But the kind of amazing thing, though, is whereas numbers of establishments of Hemiptera, number of imports of plants has really skyrocketed, we don't see the same skyrocketing of Hemiptera establishments. And so the question is, why isn't there not a closer association between imports and numbers of establishments? And this is something that intuitively we tend to think that because imports reflect pathway pressure, pathway volume, that establishments should strictly sort of track imports. But one of the things that's probably key in understanding this is the concept of source species pools. And so when you think of a source species pool, that is the potential for organisms in their native range, there's probably a finite number of species that can invade. And so if we consider in the source species pool, if there's actually an infinite source species pool, then over time, as we draw from that source species pool, we never deplete it, and we just continue to draw at the same rate, and we get this ever increasing rate or constant rate of species establishments. But if there's a finite species pool, that over time we deplete that species pool and the number of invasions tapers off. And this is something that actually in a paper in 2003, Levine and D'Antonio captured, and they found this kind of leveling off of invasions happening with mollusks, plant pathogens, and with insects. And so with the Hemiptera, this is something that Matt, Mike, and I were interested in doing. And so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but one of the problems with analyzing this kind of data is we don't actually observe establishments. Instead, what happens is we observe discoveries. And very often there's quite a long time lag between establishments and discoveries. And so Matt and Mike, being economists, they came up with a very clever method for basically modeling this time lag between establishments and discoveries. And it was based on using essentially discoveries of native species as a proxy for discovery, the discovery effort, essentially the effort that goes into discovering new species. And by using this proxy for discoveries, we were able to kind of account for this time lag in how that discovery effort may vary through time. And so basically the interesting thing, this is what we found out, so the actual observed establishment discoveries is this time lag here, which very similar to a lot of these other time series show, which somewhere around 1850, we've had this constant rate of discovery of new species. And by applying this model, we just discovered that our estimated establishments, which is the dotted line, because discoveries, there's usually just quite a long time lag. And in fact, we estimated a very long average time lag for these Hemiptera species of 50 or more years between establishment and discovery. And that the establishments have actually been going on for a much longer time. And the other thing that using this method, we found an overall average of 27, what in the literature is referred to as invasion debt. That is the number of undiscovered invasions is around 27%, which is quite high, maybe particularly high for Hemiptera because they tend to be small insects and people don't notice them. But for among importing areas, we found that this invasion debt is actually quite variable among regions. So especially in some of the areas, it's, for example, the Neotropics and the Australasia, the estimated invasion debt was over 40%, so quite high. So kind of in conclusion with this, what we found, I think that really is going on is that in most of these series, what we see is a sort of constant rate of establishment of species. And really it's a much more complicated thing. That's probably what's going on is we're over time around the world seeing accelerating connectivity, accelerating globalization, accelerating imports. But at the same time, there are other things that are going on. We have depletion of source species pool. And one of the things I didn't mention also is that, which is very difficult to quantify, we have changes in biosecurity practices that back prior to in the early 1900s and prior to that, countries had almost no biosecurity. And over time, we have made progress in implementing biosecurity. And so I think the combination of the species depletion and increasing biosecurity would result in sort of this the attenuation of invasion risk, but at the same time, we have accelerating imports. And so you put these things together and you get this sort of constant trickle of species establishments and explains this patterns. So that's my last slide. And yeah, I guess we can open it up to questions. I don't know, Mike and Nurum, how you want to handle questions.
Thanks very much, Sandy. I'm presuming, let's just get the screen back on. And again, welcome to those that joined as you started speaking. Sandy, going on 200 people listening to you from all over the world. I thought it would be interesting to know exactly where everybody is and draw a map of the invasion of our computers or here in FABI by our friends from around the world. Thanks for a really fabulous presentation. Deeply enjoyed. I'm going to open up the for discussion. I'll just make note of the point that David Richardson, as said earlier, Professor David Richardson, who is the director of the Center for Invasion Biology, down about 1,500 kilometers from where I'm sitting at the University of Stellenbosch University, has now joined us. And Dave, you'll be listening to me, and we'll give you a chance, maybe after the questions, just to say hello to everybody and to say a few words about the CIB too. because I think people will be interested. We don't have a lot of time, so let's go to the floor. So please feel free to ask questions. Brett is in the room here and is going to help me to identify hands going up because I can't see those. And I see a couple of questions in the chat box, which I'll go to as well. So, are there any hands up? Let's do that part first. And Brett, if you can just help me. Say again?
No.
So let's go. I'm purposely not asking my questions. And Sandy, I have a large, there's Jeff. Hi, Jeff. Nice to see you. I have a large list of questions, and maybe we'll do that on a Zoom between just the two of us. Otherwise, I'll be hogging time. So Jeff, why don't we start with you, and then we get the ball rolling. I think people are shy this afternoon.
Sure. Hey, Sandy, great talk. Thanks so much. You kind of touched on this at the very end, but what kind of signals do you see of our biosecurity efforts? Can you see any of the declines, or is that a tough one?
You know, I think the trouble with these temporal analyses is that it's very often difficult to differentiate a lot of the effects of things like depletion of source species pools from biosecurity. I think that actually it's an interesting subject that would be cool to look at in the future. I mean, I know in terms of there's a paper that Eki Brokerhoff and Mark Kimberly and I published a few years ago where we were focusing on this source species pool, depletion of source species pool question, and we're able to kind of get a pretty good handle on that. The biosecurity impacts, I'm convinced that they're actually quite large, because this is something, at least say, for example, with invasions of Hemiptera and say foliage feeding insects, we've seen, at least in North America, and I think many other parts of the world, actual declines in numbers. And I think that they're probably not totally explained just by depletion of source species pools. And I think I'm convinced that a lot of it has to do with biosecurity. On the other hand, you know, biosecurity, it's always sort of a moving target. My sort of feeling is that for national biosecurity programs, they've gotten pretty good at reducing the impact of pathways that are related to things like importation of plant products like fruit and vegetables, and even of plants. But then you have new invasions pathways popping up with things like smuggling or just movement of plants with passengers and that sort of thing. So so basically, to answer your question, Jeff, in this model that I showed, we really just lumped together all these things which are sort of moving parts that are that we couldn't account for, which include depletion of source species pool, changes in biosecurity. And in fact, I think someone in the chat box I just noticed too, there actually are probably also changes in the shipping technology that also probably, they end up influencing like what the pathways are. And sort of, I think that when you have changes, and I think a good example of this is provided by the explosion of solid wood packaging material. It's basically an invasion pathway that, with the advent of containerized cargo after World War II, became much more ubiquitous. And as such, it opened up the world to a whole bunch of new invasion, new species with that pathway. So, but yeah, to answer your question, I think that's actually would be a really interesting thing to try to it's a difficult thing, but I think it's possible to tease out the impacts of specific biosecurity practices.
Thanks for the question. I think that question is a question that many of us are asking, so I'm sure many people are interested in Sally's response. So let me just jump to the chat box now. Angela Mutama is from Kenya, and she says, my question is, knowing the projected increase in invasions in a warming climate, is it possible to use modeling for the prediction of exotic pests and pathogens?
Yeah, I saw that. So yeah, thanks, Angela. And I think it's a really interesting question. Again, it's a very difficult thing to quantify, but I think there is no question that we're seeing a lot of, I mean, as many of you know, there are a lot of cases of species expanding their range. And I think we have better data on species that are expanding their range as a result of climate change. I think in terms of looking at, so things like intercontinental movement of species and how that's influenced by climate change, my personal feeling is it's a much more difficult thing to understand how intercontinental movement is affected by climate change. I mean, my sort of gut feeling is that it actually is affected because climate change, it creates new regions where species can establish, but to understand how climate change is affecting intercontinental movement of species is very difficult to quantify. On the other hand, the one thing that I do think is important to keep in mind, though, is that this pattern of intercontinental movement of at least insect species, I really think the driving force on that is really the propagule pressure effect. That is that the globalization and movement of species with cargo and passengers, and that I definitely believe that climate change probably is aggravating it, but probably it's the propagule pressure that's the primary driver of the invasion phenomenon.
Thanks, Sandy. I'll go to the next question, at least that I can see here, from Misha Kosov. Would you expect the number of invasions for a given area to eventually plateau? That's something I was thinking about. Due to something like niche saturation, would you perhaps expect invasions to tend towards global? I think you'd actually dealt a bit with this homogenization of insect communities.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. And it's something that I don't think there's been a lot of exploration, because it's true that we have on the, in terms of the sort of, you have the donor regions and the recipient regions. From the perspective of the donor regions, as I was mentioning before, there is a sort of finite number of good invaders. And we probably, as you move species over time, you deplete that supply of good invaders. And then in terms of the recipient region, you probably do have a certain amount of saturation of available niches over time. And that's something, though, again, I think it's very difficult to get a handle on that. And perhaps it's even difficult to separate those two factors out. The one thing that I wanted, maybe, I think I didn't point out that maybe is worth pointing out, is that in terms of this effect of depleting source species pools, I really think that is a definite phenomenon that we can see happening around the world. Unfortunately, there's one of the things that's happening simultaneously is that different parts of the world are opening up to trade that previously weren't trading with other regions. And so when you have, over time, we have a depletion of source species pools from certain regions, but then as imports open up from new regions, that opens up new species pools that haven't been depleted. And I think that that's one of the things that again plays a role in, even though we have this depletion of source species pools, we keep getting new invasions because we keep opening up to new source species pools, either because we're importing from new regions or we're importing new things, for example, new commodities, and that those commodities may be associated with completely new source species.
You're in a topic that we really should have 2 or 3 hours just to debate, and I'm sorry we're not around the table to do so. I'm going to, if colleagues will allow me, to just ask 3 more questions that I can see in the chat box, and then hand over to Dave, because we're at our hour. We've lost 20 of our friends, so I don't want to lose everybody before we, as tempting as it is to continue, before we close off. So I'll go to the next question. This comes from Sia Agre. Says, hello. Would you partly attribute the high number of insect invasions in North America to the advances in technology and research on invasion species in that region to be able to detect and report the insect invasions?
Yeah, that's definitely a really important question that I think, so just to repeat it, I think that basically is this idea that one of the reasons why in North America we have such a high number of insect species that have invaded, its part has to do with reporting. And this is one of the things, and I mentioned before in the analyses that we've done, unfortunately, there are just certain world regions where we don't have reliable information on numbers of non-native species. And this is, I'm not the only person who's recognized this, but I think this is one of the challenges that we all face in terms of really understanding what's going on with this, is that we really need to do a better job of surveying for non-native species and reporting those data in databases. And unfortunately, it's a difficult thing to tease apart, because there is definitely this reporting, as I mentioned before, there's variation geographically and through time in sort of discovery effort that goes on.
Well, you touch on the issue of size and the size of invaders, and I think many of us also about microbes, and they're smaller, and that problem becomes even bigger. So let me just go to the next question. Who is it? I'm sorry, I don't want to leave anybody out. Benno Augustinus is saying, do you expect climate change? I think we dealt with climate change, and therefore change in ecoclimatic niches will have a negative or positive effect on the number of species in source populations. I think you might have touched part answered that question.
Yeah.
Sure. Should we just go to the next question, or? And I hope Benno will not be upset for me doing it. I'm rushing now, and I see more questions. If you wonder, those are glossy ibis. They go to sleep about now. They're not happy that we're going over time. Have you detected any effects on non-native insect invasions on local decline of native insects? That's interesting.
Yeah. Oh, that's and of course, with my whole talk, I didn't really address impacts at all. And I think that question, which is really interesting one, which is impacts on native insects. I think it's the nature of entomology. We tend to be focused on sort of economic entomology, which means we usually focus on impacts on plants, on things like crops and agricultural or forest crops, and we tend to sort of gloss over impacts on other insect species. And I would be the first to say that we're sort of grossly ignorant about how we've had thousands of these insect invasions, and how are they? I think that there's no question that they're driving, they're having a negative impact on native species. And there are just a few sort of case histories where we know. I know, for example, around the world, honeybees, which in fact, the ironic thing is we all know that honeybees are one of the few intentionally introduced insects around the world. But I know I've seen estimates of that honeybee establishments have driven thousands of native bee populations to extinction. And I tend to think that that's probably true for other insect invasions as well, but I'm just not aware of data. And I think this gets back to the question that insect populations, most insect species, we don't pay any attention to at all. That we really just pay attention to sort of a handful of these species that have impacts, and there are all these species that are rather rare, that many of them aren't even described. And unfortunately, I think we're totally missing out on these impacts and the impacts on insect diversity. And that's, again, I feel like that's an area that's very important that we really should be focusing on more.
Thanks, Sandy. I mean, you're raising so many interesting questions. As I said, we could debate for hours. The Hardy-Dar are recording more rapidly. I'm going to apologize to Matthew and Caitlin and ask them to talk with you directly, which you have there. Everybody has your email, and ask their questions. So I am going to come back to you myself with some discussions and some suggestions for things that we might do together. But we need to end. We have to give David an opportunity just to say hello. So Dave, if you would like to share your screen and just join everyone and say hello from the Center of Excellence in Invasion Biology, there you are. Sorry that you couldn't get us earlier. It's nice to see you, David. Please take the floor. You're muted, David. We can't hear you.
Hi, Mike. Hi, Sandy. Hi, Marcus, Merriman, and everyone else. I know a whole interview, and apologies that I was not able to sign up earlier. Thanks a lot, Sandy, for a really interesting talk. I was asked to say just a few words about our Center of Excellence on Invasion Biology, the CIB. We've been in existence for about 18 years. We're a national center of excellence, like the Tree Health Center of Excellence at FABI, and we have done a whole lot of interesting things. We've produced over 1,800 publications. We've trained 500 students. We've had a lot of input to national and international policy, and last year we produced this this encyclopedic book of 1,000 or so pages on all aspects of biological invasions in South Africa, and we do a whole lot of interesting things. We hosted Sandy at a workshop that we held a few years ago that led to a special issue on insect invasions, and we hold such workshops almost every year that have led to I think quite important special issues and other publications. Many thanks to FABI for asking the CIB to be co-host of the seminar. It's been really interesting and useful, and many thanks, Sandy, for a good talk. I'm really sorry that I missed the first third of it. However, I will watch the recorded version.
David, thank you so much. And it's really a big thank you also from our side at FABI. Many will know that we have very close relationships and collaborations with the CIB. We work in a similar space. There is overlap, and we enjoy these collaborations, and they've been very beneficial also to us at FABI. So Dave, thanks for co-hosting with us. We'll have you co-host another seminar in the coming months. I'm now going to ask the camera to move off me to Bernard Slippers. So if he can, he might have to. Would you like to sit here?
No. I'll use my computer camera. I'm not going to take much time. Just to say Sandy, thank you for an absolutely fabulous discussion. You started the talk, and Dave was referring to that workshop. Was it 2014, 2015? That started the many thoughts on this. And I think you've provided enough material for another workshop now. So we have to get you over here, and with CIB set up a follow-up on that meeting as soon as we possibly can. Hundreds of thoughts that are going through our minds, I think, at the moment to continue to discuss, and I look forward to doing so. Thank you for the effort and presenting a very special seminar. I'll say thank you to Dave and to Mike and Brett who got this going, and to Neriman and Marcus who set it all up, and Tuan is sitting here with us, always making sure that all the technical things are working. And to all the friends that have joined us from around the world, it's wonderful to see you. Look forward to doing so in person very soon again.
Thank you very much. I maybe didn't mention, for those who don't know it, and it's few, but there will be some. Bernard is the director of FABI, so he helps us get all of these things together and make things work, which we're all very grateful. Camera's going to go around to Neriman now to say a quick goodbye, and this is also a big goodbye from my side. And Sandy, thank you so much. Look forward to catching up soon.
Thank you, Sandy, for the amazing talk. I think everybody who stays at the talk now will definitely agree with me that we should host you again and make another, maybe not one, maybe more than one. Like Bernard said, maybe a workshop. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And I must say that with Sandy's and Dave's CIB, including to this talk, we got more than 100 new participants. So we are hoping to see you all in our coming seminar series as well. But for this, I again would like to thank you all for joining, and hope to see you for the other talks. Have a nice evening or day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.